Unscrew those 10 screws and note that those 4 screws will come out with the whole cover, not like the other 6 screws, because they were designed to stay attached to the cover. Just unscrew each one of those 4 screws until you hear tick sound, and if you faced any problem while taking the cover off, just unscrew them one more while taking the cover off. After finishing unscrewing the screws, spot any of the front corners of the laptop, as they are easy entry points. Then use an opening tool like this to separate the bottom of the laptop from the laptop. Note, the opening tool should have short head so you don't damage the connectors inside. Do it like this. And repeat the same process for all of the 3 sides of the laptop, front, left, and right. Then take off the cover carefully from the front all the way back. Then unscrew the heatsink screws, which there are 8 screws, to remove the heatsink. Note, those will stay attached to the heat sink the same way as the 4 screws of the cover attached to the cover. Then remove the heat sink carefully. Clean the thermal paste from the CPU and the GPU and be extremely careful not to take off any of the electronic components. I have masked the areas where the electronic components generally may exist red, and green where the electronic components generally don't exist. I was using special spray for cleaning electronic components. It's neither mainly for softening the thermal paste for easy cleaning nor for getting rid of the thermal paste, but I was just testing if it can help me in any way.
I am the one, the way your son don't need a gun to get me.
Try to avoid using solid tools like the blue opening tool which I was using, because that will higher the chance of taking off some of the electronic components. Always use the softest and most gentle way available to clean the CPU and the GPU from the thermal paste with caution in mind. As you can see, I am cleaning the safe areas first. Also, I was able to spot where the electronic components are, which was hard a little because they are covered with thermal paste. If I had the right recording angle, then you may be able to spot the electronic components as well. Anyway, just stay extremely careful in the areas I mentioned earlier. Try to avoid using solid tools like the blue opening tool which I was using, because that will higher the chance of taking off some of the electronic components. Always use the softest and most gentle way available to clean the CPU and the GPU from the thermal paste with caution in mind. Clean the heatsink from the thermal paste as well. Apply the new thermal paste slowly so you don't fill the place with thermal paste, then you need to clean again. If this is your first time applying the thermal paste and you are using thermal paste syringe, then I strongly recommend you to try to apply it to a sheet of paper away from the computer, so your hand get used to the process. That way you will not mess up the place with the thermal paste and you will be able to know how to apply the force to the plunger of the syringe to get the right amount of the thermal paste. Make sure you have applied the right amount of the thermal paste so the CPU and GPU surfaces and the heatsink surface have no gaps in between. Otherwise the heat will not be transferred correctly from the surfaces of the CPU and GPU to the surface of the heatsink. When you are done, assemble everything back and tighten the screws well, but not too much. Otherwise you may damage the screws place or the screw itself. For the heatsink screws you have to be precise, because tightening it too much will damage the screw place or the screw itself, or less tightening will leave a gap between the processing units, CPU and GPU, and the heatsink. Make sure that all the wires and the connectors in place, then attach the cover slowly, carefully, and make sure everything is going into place. You will notice that there is a small gap where the 4 screws which stay attached to the cover. Because those screws push up the cover, you need just to screw them the right way until you see no gaps. You can leave the other screws outside until you finish testing the laptop, so you don't need to unscrew them again in case of a problem. Once you are sure everything was done successfully, then screw up the screws and wrap up the job. Make sure that the laptop is working properly by testing its components, speakers, mic, etc., and test its heat dissipation through running a heavy software, video game, or special software for stressing the CPU and the GPU. As you can see, there are 15.8 GB RAM, so the RAM installation was successful.